HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents My Years with General Motors by Alfred P. Sloan, Jr. Read by David Colacci. Why My Years with General Motors is Must Reading. Peter F. Drucker. Alfred P. Sloan's My Years with General Motors was an instant bestseller when it appeared in 1964. 2 years before Sloan's death in 1966 at age 90. It has remained a favorite among managers and management students. Everyone to whom I have recommended it, and I have been recommending it for 25 years to friends, clients, and students, has found it fascinating and enjoyable reading. But Sloan himself would have been dismayed by this response. The only time he was really angry at me in our 20-year relationship, it began in 1943 and ended only a few months before his death in 1966, was when I praised the book as enjoyable in my review of it in the New York Times. I had, Sloan scolded, knowingly misled the reader. The book was not meant to be enjoyable. It was meant to establish a new profession, that of the professional manager, and to spell out the professional manager's role as leader and decision-maker. My Years with General Motors was written primarily to rebut, or at least to counterbalance, a book Sloan thought to be pernicious. My book on General Motors, Concept of the Corporation, published in 1946. Concept of the Corporation was the first study of management as a discipline, the first study of a big corporation from within, of its constitutional principles, of its structure, its basic relationships, its strategies and policies. It was the result of 2 years of research undertaken in 1943 through 45 with the full cooperation of GM management and at GM's invitation. But when the book came out, GM's senior executives were so greatly offended by it that it became unmentionable in GM for many years and was, in fact, verboten for GM managers. For it asked whether some GM policies, e.g., labor and employee relations, the use and role of central office staffs, and dealer relations, had not become obsolescent. This was lèse-majesté for GM executives, and I have never been completely forgiven. But Sloan was cut from a different cloth. When his associates attacked me in a meeting called to discuss the book, Sloan immediately rose to my defense. "I fully agree with you," he said to his colleagues. "Mr. Drucker is dead wrong, but he did precisely what he told us he would do when we asked him in, and he is as entitled to his opinions, wrong though they are, as you or I." Indeed, that meeting marked the beginning of my personal relationship with Alfred Sloan. While I had been working on the book, I had seen Sloan quite often, but usually in a fairly big meeting and at a GM office. For the next 20 years he would, however, ask me once or twice a year to have lunch alone with him in his New York apartment. There he would discuss the plans for his philanthropies, especially the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research and the Sloan School of Management at MIT. Above all, he wanted to talk about My Years with General Motors, on which he was working for many years. He asked for my opinions and carefully listened, and he never once took my advice. Sloan was the first to realize, well before I myself did, that my book, Concept of the Corporation, was going to establish management as a discipline, as it has indeed done. But that was exactly what was wrong in Sloan's eyes. He was proud, and deservedly so, to have been the first to work out systematic organization in a big company, planning and strategy, measurements, the principle of decentralization, in short, basic concepts of a discipline of management. Indeed, to digress, Sloan's work as the designer and architect of management was a major element in America's performance in World War II. It enabled American industry to mobilize itself for record production, and to do so practically overnight, from total unpreparedness and deep demoralizing depression. and it surely was a foundation for America's economic leadership in the 40 years following World War II, and for the major lesson the Japanese learned from us and used to become a great economic power themselves. But to Sloan, the discipline of management came second, and a very distant second, to the profession of the manager. Going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, there have been two parallel but separate approaches to governance. One is the constitutionalist approach. Government in politics or organizations has to be based on a clear structure that above all provides for orderly succession and safeguards against tyranny. The other approach is what in the history of political thought has been called the education of the prince. What matters is the character and the moral principles of rulers. We have long known that both are needed. Indeed, my own books fall into both categories, with my 1954 Practice of Management, primarily constitutionalist, and the 1966 The Effective Executive, published only a few months after Alfred Sloan's death, squarely in the tradition of the education of the prince. Sloan, who was an amazingly well-read man, knew both traditions. He more than once told me how he had gone back again and again to the American Constitution to develop management organization and management concepts for General Motors and for the large corporation altogether. But it was axiomatic to him that the core had to be the ruler, that is, the professional manager, as a practitioner, as a leader, and as exemplar. He immediately saw that concept of the corporation was important, and that was why he thought it so pernicious. It would, he told me, misdirect and lead far astray both practicing managers and academicians. Expressed in today's language, Sloan criticized me for putting management before leadership. He felt it his duty to produce the antidote. Sloan had originally planned to retire as CEO in 1943 at age 67, after 35 years of running GM, first for 10 years as Chief Operating Officer, and then for 23 years as Chief Executive Officer. In preparation for this, he had begun in the late 30s to gather material for an autobiographical sketch, not even meant for publication, but as a kind of farewell address to his colleagues. But when 1943 came, America was at war. The 3 or 4 men whom Sloan had been grooming for GM's top management were all working for the war effort and too old to take over by the time they would become available again. Sloan therefore decided, reluctantly, to stay on for the duration of the war and for the transition period following it. During this time he would then be grooming another and younger team to succeed him and the colleagues of his generation. Then, when he decided that he had to write a book to establish the persona of the professional manager, he went back to the notes he had made almost 10 years earlier, and for an entirely different purpose. The result is an extraordinary achievement. Ostensibly, it is an autobiography, and it reads like one. Actually, it is far more a succession of case studies. Yet, despite its didactic purpose, it is lively, enjoyable, readable, and about a person. Only the person is not really Alfred P. Sloan as he was. It is Alfred P. Sloan as a model and exemplar for the professional manager. The Sloan of my years with General Motors is often criticized as impersonal and cold. This is, in truth, how he portrays himself in the book. He strongly believed that a chief executive must not have friends on the job. He pointed out to me that neither Abraham Lincoln nor Franklin D. Roosevelt, the most effective presidents in American history, had friends among their colleagues and associates. And the presidents who did, Grant, Truman, of whom Sloan thought highly, and Eisenhower, whom he distrusted, had promptly been betrayed by their friends. A friend only too easily becomes a favorite, Sloan argued. and a CEO has to be impartial and judge only by performance. But until deafness isolated him in old age, Sloan had been a man of strong friendships, and not all of them were off the job. His closest friend for many years was Walter P. Chrysler, who had been the head of GM's Buick division until Sloan persuaded him to strike out on his own. Chrysler started the automobile company that bears his name in large part because Sloan pointed out to him the opportunity created by the decline of the Ford Motor Company in the mid-20s, but also because Sloan clearly saw that with Ford rapidly going downhill, GM, in its own interest, needed a strong competitor. And Chrysler remained a close friend until he died in 1940, at age 65. Above all, Sloan had tremendous personal warmth and was unbelievably generous, with his time as well as with his money. Wherever I went in GM in the course of my study, I was told, often by fairly junior people, how Sloan had come to their rescue, usually unasked. How, for instance, he had given up an entire Christmas vacation to find the hospital where the badly burnt child of a plant manager could get the best medical care, and he had never even met the plant manager. I always asked, "To whom would you go if you were in a serious jam?" Most people immediately answered, "Alfred Sloan, of course." Sloan built GM as much through inspiring personal admiration and trust in his integrity as he did through policy and strategy. The strong chieftains who were running GM's large divisions, Chevrolet, Buick, Cadillac, through the 20s, and in some cases much longer, had been the founders and had built successful large companies before selling out to GM. Each was older than Sloan and infinitely richer. For the accessory business that Sloan sold to GM in 1916, as a result of which he moved into GM management, was still quite small. Each of these men was a very large GM shareholder. Each was intensely jealous of his autonomy and resented any interference from headquarters. But within a few years each became a Sloan admirer and a faithful team member. Indeed, Sloan was people-focused to the point of being quixotic. My years with General Motors was substantially finished in 1954, yet not published until 10 years later. For Sloan refused to publish as long as any of the GM people mentioned in the book was still alive. "A manager does not criticize subordinates in public," he said, "and some of the things I say in the book may be interpreted as criticism." Sloan was then already 80 years old and beginning to be frail, and some of the still living GM people mentioned in the book were a good 15 years younger. Sloan's editor at Doubleday pleaded, "Mr. Sloan, you risk not living long enough for the book to be published." And the editor actually went to those people, all of whom, without exception, said that they did not feel criticized in the least, and urged Sloan to publish. But Sloan did not budge. "If I don't live long enough," he said, "you'll have to publish posthumously. People come before publishing schedules." He did outlive every one, and on the day of the death of the last living person mentioned in the book, Sloan released it for publication. To be sure, Sloan was not touchy-feely, but he was extraordinarily concerned about people, focused on them, and above all respectful of them. Yet there are no people in Sloan's My Years with General Motors. For the professional manager, Sloan believed, manages through the force of facts and not through the force of personality. "Bedside manners," I once heard him say in a speech to GM managers, "is no substitute for the right diagnosis." Sloan also rigorously censored out of My Years with General Motors every one of his personal concerns and interests. He was deeply involved with politics, always on the losing side, and took an active part in the Landon campaign of 1937 and the Dewey Campaign of 1948. He had a 12-year love-hate relationship with Franklin D. Roosevelt. He admired Roosevelt's effectiveness, but he detested Roosevelt the man and opposed the New Deal. "Al Smith was a much better man, but Roosevelt was surely a much better president," he once said to me, to my great surprise. Yet the only mention of Roosevelt in Sloan's book is of someone in remote Washington who refused to stop Michigan's Governor Frank Murphy from supporting the Union in the 1937 sit-down strike at GM. Of the New Deal there is no mention at all. These were very important events for me and for GM, but they were historical accidents and have nothing to do with the job of the professional manager, he said, when I argued that a history of the 30s without the New Deal and Roosevelt is like Hamlet without the prince. Similarly, there is no mention whatever in the book of the two causes to which Sloan devoted long, loving hours: automotive safety and the General Motors Institute in Flint, now GMI Tech. There is only the briefest mention of his half-brother Raymond, who, 18 years younger, was Sloan's only child. His death, while only in his 50s, was the greatest personal tragedy in my life, Sloan once said. There is no mention at all that through Raymond, who was a pioneer in the field, Alfred Sloan became deeply interested in hospital management and worked hard on the organization of the Sloan Kettering Institute and the planning and direction of its cancer research. "These were self-indulgences," he said. "They no more belong in a book on the professional manager than that my wife collects antiques or that a chief financial officer wears loud ties." Far more important, however, than that my years with General Motors present Sloan the mentor rather than Sloan the man, is that the book does not, for most readers, make clear the lessons for the sake of which Sloan wrote the book. It is, I still maintain, the best management book, and whether one agrees with everything Sloan proposes is quite irrelevant. But it has had remarkably little impact on the practice of management, despite its wide readership and popular appeal. That it presents itself as an autobiography explains in large measure why it is not being read as the guide to action Sloan intended it. When he told me of his plans, I was enthusiastic. A book on the profession of management and on the professional manager was, I thought, a first-rate idea, and I still think so. But to cast it into the form of an autobiography would, I was afraid, diffuse the focus. Why not write a book on the topic itself and use GM only to give examples? No, Sloan came back, he wasn't competent to do that. But Mr. Sloan, I argued, why not call it something like The Professional Manager, with a subtitle such as Lessons from 40 Years with GM? Sloan thought that far too pretentious. At least, I proposed, put a short section at the end of each chapter to point out the lesson. "Mr. Drucker," Sloan said sternly, "I am not writing for morons. I am writing for experienced managers. They have no need for me to point out the obvious." But, as every editor soon learns, the obvious is precisely what needs to be pointed out. Otherwise it will be overlooked. What then are the main lessons in my years with General Motors, at least as I read Alfred Sloan's intentions? This is how I would paraphrase them. The first is that management is a profession, and that the manager is, or should be, a professional. This may sound trite in 1990. It was far from obvious 30 years ago. But, frankly, while most managers by now preach it, not too many yet practice it. Like any other professional, a physician, for instance, or a lawyer, the professional manager has a client, the enterprise. He is bound to subordinate his own interests to those of the client. It is duty to the client that characterizes the professional. Professionals do not make decisions by opinions nor according to their preferences. They make them according to the facts. This, I believe, is the meaning of the one section in My Years with General Motors that many readers, myself included, find overly long. The chapter on Charles F. Kettering's copper-cooled engine. Sloan had the greatest admiration for Kettering and considered him America's outstanding 20th century inventor. But even so great a man, Sloan says in this chapter in so many words, can only damage and defeat himself when he clings to his preferences and predilections against the facts. The job of a professional manager is not to like people. It is not to change people. It is to put their strengths to work. And whether one approves of people or of the way they do their work, their performance is the only thing that counts, and indeed the only thing that the professional manager is permitted to pay attention to. I once said to Sloan that I had rarely seen more different people than the two men who during my study had run the most profitable divisions of GM, Chevrolet and Cadillac. "You are quite mistaken," he said. "These two men were very much alike. Both performed." But performance is more than the bottom line. It is also setting an example, and this requires integrity. Limited only to these twin boundaries, business performance and performance as example and mentor, there should be absolute tolerance and indeed the greatest diversity. Dissent, even conflict, are necessary, are indeed desirable. Without dissent and conflict there is no understanding, and without understanding there are only wrong decisions. To me, the most fascinating parts of Sloan's book are the memoranda in which he first elicits dissent and then synthesizes dissenting views into an understanding and in the end into consensus and commitment. Leadership is not charisma. It is not public relations. It is not showmanship. It is performance, consistent behavior, trustworthiness. Finally, and perhaps the most important lesson, the professional manager is a servant. Rank does not confer privilege. It does not give power. It imposes responsibility. One can argue with Sloan's postulates. Indeed, Sloan very much wanted the reader to argue with them. "Otherwise they won't take them seriously," he once said when I raised the question. But they are why Alfred Sloan wrote the book, and why My Years with General Motors is must reading. Preface. That this book tells the story of General Motors in good part from my point of view is reasonably justified, I trust, by the circumstance that, as Chief Executive Officer of the corporation for 23 years, and as a member of the board and a participant in its committees for 45 years, I have been situated at the focal point of major policy-making and administration. I trust, too, that the use made of materials from the past, which I either wrote or was responsible for, is justified for a similar reason. They either made or influenced policy, and thereby bear a relation to the events of history. This approach to the book made it necessary to do a substantial amount of research, and it should not be surprising, therefore, that considerable collaboration was required. I am indebted first of all to John MacDonald of Fortune magazine, who worked closely with me in conceiving the book and in helping me to set down on paper what I know about General Motors, including, I might say, many things that I did not know or had forgotten when we began this project a number of years ago. I asked Mr. MacDonald to work with me, and the editors of Fortune kindly granted him a leave of absence. Our first intention was to write a series of essays on American business with special reference to General Motors. As we got into a study of the facts, the project grew far beyond our original concept. We felt compelled, stage by stage, to stay with it to the end. The designation of Mr. MacDonald as editor, which he chose, is broadly defined, as I have indicated. Mr. MacDonald's scholarship, craftsmanship, imagination, professional standards, and understanding of business strategy made possible the creation of this book. I am indebted equally to Catherine Stevens, who has served as close associate to me and Mr. MacDonald from the beginning. We were fortunate to receive the benefit of her spirit and intelligence, and her versatile capabilities in organizing and managing a project of such magnitude and complexity. She was, you might say, as well, our editor. John, Catherine, and myself were the motivating force that kept the work in motion to completion, and we had help from other quarters. To our editorial and technical assistants, Felice Faust, Barbara Mullen, and Mary Ross, I give my admiration and thanks for their loyalty and high performance over the long period of their service on the project. I also wish to thank Doris Foster, Lynn Gorey, and Margaret Breckenridge for their fine contributions. To Alfred D. Chandler, Associate Professor of History, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I am indebted for his assistance as our consulting historian and research associate. One of our major studies of the evolution of General Motors was most creatively carried out by him, and he has given his good mind to reviewing successive drafts of the manuscript. From time to time, in one place or another, I have called upon a number of professional talents. Among those whose contributions are importantly reflected in the book are Daniel Seligman of Fortune, whose editorial skill and judgment helped solve a number of thorny problems, and William Whipple, who gave fine editorial assistance throughout the book. I want to record my thanks for the substantial aid of Sanford S. Parker of Fortune, who applied his powers of economic analysis and editorial organization to several areas of study, notably the automobile market and its history. I am also grateful for the special assistance of Charles E. Silberman of Fortune, Frank M. Ricciardi, formerly of the American Management Association, now of Monroe Calculating Machine Company, Lytton, Nathan Glazer, the sociologist, Louis Banks of Fortune, Ruth Miller, formerly of Fortune, Francis Wilson of John Wiley & Sons, and Sidney S. Alexander of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and for the interest of Jason Epstein. Mary Grace of Fortune gave her meticulous eye to reviewing the manuscript, and Ralph Stein, author of Sports Cars of the World, kindly advised us with his special knowledge of early automobiles. The distinguished photographer Walker Evans was our picture editor. Although this book represents my own personal views and is not a corporation matter, I am indebted to all the divisions and the general offices of General Motors for their cooperation. The number of individuals is so large that I can only salute them here as a group and send each of them my warm appreciation of their valued personal contributions to my effort. Among many old friends and associates whom I consulted are Donaldson Brown, the late Harlow H. Curtis, Harley J. Earl, Paul Garrett, the late Richard H. Grant, Ormond E. Hunt, Charles Stewart Mott, the late James D. Mooney, John L. Pratt, Meyer L. Prentice, John J. Schumann, Jr., the late Edgar W. Smith, the late Charles E. Wilson, Walter S. Carpenter, Jr., the late George Whitney, and Henry C. Alexander. Quite a number of people in different walks of life corresponded with me or came to see me to assist with one matter or another that came up in the book. I wish especially to thank Win Murphy, formerly secretary to W.C. Durant, for a number of recollections going back before 1920, Frank A. Howard for helpful talks on the evolution of concepts of research, William Zeckendorf for a conversation in which he gave me some inspiring thoughts on Mr. Durant, Eddie Rickenbacker for his recollection of the sale to him of Eastern Airlines, the late James H. Kindleberger for kindly reviewing a portion of the text dealing with our interest in North American aviation, Dr. Arnold J. Zurcher for valued comments, Hedley Donovan for wise observations on our earliest manuscript, and my brother Raymond for reading and commenting on the entire book. With all that we have done in research...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?